In a world where the line between justice and tyranny had long since blurred, Mira stood atop a crumbling skyscraper, her piercing blue eyes scanning the neon-lit dystopia below. The acrid stench of burning flesh and industrial waste filled her nostrils, a constant reminder of the society she served. Her lithe figure, clad in a form-fitting black bodysuit, tensed as she spotted her target, a known rebel sympathizer scurrying through the crowded streets like a rat in a maze. "I am the instrument of justice," Mira thought, her fingers tightening around the grip of her pulse rifle. The weight of the weapon, cold and familiar, grounded her in the moment. She had lost count of the lives she had ended in the name of order, each kill etched into her soul like a tally mark of damnation. With practiced ease, Mira descended the building, her movements fluid and predatory. The streets below were a cesspool of humanity, teeming with the desperate and the depraved. Emaciated children with hollow eyes begged for scraps, while augmented elites strode past, their chrome implants gleaming in the artificial light. As she closed in on her target, memories of her own tragic past bubbled to the surface. Mira saw herself as a child, cowering in fear as syndicate enforcers dragged her parents away, their crime nothing more than speaking out against the system. The orphanages that followed were a nightmare of abuse and indoctrination, molding her into the perfect weapon. "Please, I have a family," the rebel sympathizer pleaded as Mira cornered him in a filthy alley. His eyes, wide with terror, reflected the neon signs advertising pleasure and pain in equal measure. Mira's voice was cold as she replied, "So did I." The pulse rifle hummed to life, and in a flash of searing energy, the man's head exploded like an overripe melon. Brain matter and skull fragments painted the alley walls in a gruesome mural of finality. As she reported the kill to her handlers, a seed of doubt took root in Mira's mind. The man's final words echoed in her thoughts, a haunting refrain that refused to be silenced. Days turned to weeks, and with each new assignment, Mira found herself questioning the narrative she had been fed. The rebels she hunted were not the monsters she had been led to believe. They were teachers, doctors, and laborers, ordinary people driven to desperation by a system that viewed them as disposable. One particularly harrowing mission led her to an underground rebel base. As Mira infiltrated the compound, she stumbled upon a makeshift hospital. The sight that greeted her would forever be seared into her memory. Rows of beds filled with the broken bodies of those the system had discarded. Children with missing limbs, victims of illegal organ harvesting operations sanctioned by the elite. Adults whose minds had been shattered by experimental neurotechnology, their eyes vacant and mouths frozen in silent screams. A young doctor, her hands covered in blood, looked up at Mira with defiance. "Are you here to finish what your masters started?" she spat. Mira's finger hovered over the trigger, her training warring with her growing conscience. I don't understand," she stammered, lowering her weapon. The doctor, sensing Mira's hesitation, launched into a tirade that shook the bounty hunter to her core. She spoke of the syndicate's true nature, a cabal of sociopaths who maintained their power through fear and manipulation. The rebels were not terrorists, but freedom fighters struggling against impossible odds. As Mira listened, the carefully constructed walls of her psyche began to crumble. Memories she had long suppressed came flooding back, the screams of her parents, the feel of a guard's rough hands on her young body, the taste of blood in her mouth as she fought for scraps in the orphanage. "What have I become?" Mira whispered, her voice breaking. The realization of her complicity in the syndicate's atrocities hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled out of the rebel base, her mind reeling. The city streets, once a familiar hunting ground, now seemed alien and hostile. Every shadow held a potential threat, every passerby a possible informant. Mira's handlers, sensing her wavering loyalty, set a trap. They fed her false information about a high-level rebel meeting, but when she arrived at the location, she found only innocent civilians. As she hesitated, Syndicate enforcers emerged from hiding, their weapons trained on her. "You've outlived your usefulness, Mira," her former commander sneered, his augmented eyes glowing with malice. "Time to join the rest of the trash." What followed was a brutal firefight that left the street littered with bodies and awash in blood. Mira fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, her combat instincts honed by years of service now turned against her former masters. She took a pulse blast to the shoulder, the smell of her own burning flesh adding to the sensory overload of the battle. As she fled into the labyrinthine undercity, Mira's mind fractured. Reality blurred, and she found herself slipping between her own perspective and that of an outside observer. One moment, she was running through dank tunnels, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The next, she watched herself from above, a broken doll dancing to the tune of unseen puppet masters. "You can't escape what you are," a voice that sounded like her own, yet wasn't, whispered in her mind. "You are the eternal warrior, forever bound to the cycle of violence." Mira shook her head, trying to clear the fog of madness that threatened to engulf her. "No," she growled. "I choose my own path now." For weeks, she lived like a ghost, haunting the shadows of the city she once ruled. Her body, pushed to its limits, began to fail her. Infection set in where the pulse blast had seared her flesh, and fever dreams blurred the line between reality and nightmare. In her delirium, Mira saw visions of all those she had killed. They surrounded her, their accusing eyes boring into her soul. "Join us," they chanted, reaching for her with decaying hands. "Become one with the eternal hunt." Just when all seemed lost, a group of rebels found her, more dead than alive. They recognized her as the infamous bounty hunter, but something in her broken state stirred their compassion. They took her in, nursed her back to health, and showed her a kindness she had never known. As Mira recovered, she learned the full extent of the Syndicate's depravity. She saw firsthand the experiments conducted on unwilling subjects, the genetic manipulation of children to create perfect soldiers, the systematic erasure of history and culture to maintain control. The rebel leader, a scarred woman named Arya, shared her own tragic story. "They took my daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Harvested her for parts to keep some rich bastard alive. That's when I knew the system had to burn." Mira's path became clear. She would use her skills, honed through years of violence, to dismantle the very machine she had once served. But the road to redemption was paved with blood and sacrifice. The final confrontation came at the heart of the Syndicate's power, a towering monolith that housed the neural network controlling the city. Mira led a small team of rebels in a desperate assault, fighting their way through waves of augmented guards and automated defenses. The battle was a symphony of violence, a dance of death that pushed Mira to her absolute limits. She watched as her comrades fell one by one, their bodies broken and discarded like so much refuse. Yet still they pressed on, driven by a hope for a better future that Mira was only beginning to understand. In the control room, Mira faced her final test. Her former commander, now more machine than man, stood before the neural interface. "You could have had everything," he snarled, his voice distorted by cybernetic implants. "Instead, you chose to die with the vermin." Their battle was savage and intimate. Mira's combat skills clashed against the commander's augmented strength and speed. They tore at each other with feral intensity, the room becoming slick with blood and other fluids. In the end, it was Mira's humanity, the very thing the Syndicate had tried to strip from her, that gave her the edge. As she stood over her defeated foe, pulse rifle aimed at his head, Mira felt the weight of her choices bearing down on her. The commander laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "Do it," he taunted. "Prove that you're still the killer we made you." Mira's finger tightened on the trigger, every fiber of her being screaming for vengeance. But in that moment, She saw with perfect clarity the cycle of violence that had defined her existence. With trembling hands, she lowered the weapon. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm choosing a different path." As alarms blared and the building began to shake, Mira interfaced with the neural network. With the rebels' virus uploaded, the syndicate's control over the city began to crumble. But the price of freedom was high. The fail-safes built into the system meant that its destruction would take the entire tower with it. Mira knew she wouldn't make it out alive. As the room around her began to disintegrate, she allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in her life, she had made a choice that was truly her own. The explosion that followed was visible for miles, a beacon of change in a world long shrouded in darkness. In the days and weeks that followed, the people of the city would struggle to build a new society from the ashes of the old. And in quiet moments, they would whisper stories of the bounty hunter who became a savior, the eternal warrior who finally found peace in one last, selfless act. But in the deepest reaches of the Undercity, in places untouched by the light of revolution, something stirred. A figure, more shadow than substance, moved with predatory grace. And if one looked closely, they might catch a glimpse of piercing blue eyes, forever hunting, forever haunted.